Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The autumn wind swept across Sparrow Creek Valley like a whisper from the past, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Gary Wilson stood at the edge of his grandfather's property, his calloused hands resting on the worn fence post, his amber eyes scanning the land that had shaped 3 generations of his family. At 68 years old, his body carried the weight of decades, military service in distant lands, long nights under foreign stars, and the quiet battles that come when a soldier returns home to find peace in a world that never stops moving. Beside him, Rocky sat with the stillness of a statue, a German shepherd whose graying muzzle and patient eyes reflected a lifetime of loyalty. The dog's ears twitched at every sound, his body alert even in rest. They had been together for nearly 12 years now, through VA appointments and sleepless nights, through the slow process of healing wounds, both visible and hidden. Rocky wasn't just a dog, he was a brother in arms, a companion who asked for nothing but gave everything. The funeral had been 3 days ago. Arthur Wilson, Gary's grandfather, had passed quietly in his sleep at 94, leaving behind a valley that remembered his kindness and a family that would soon reveal its true colors. The law office of Henderson and Associates smelled of old leather and regret. Gary sat in a straight-backed chair, his posture military straight despite the arthritis that whispered complaints through his shoulders. Rocky lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws, watchful. Across the heavy oak desk, Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, the kind of throat clearing that precedes bad news delivered with professional distance. As executor of Arthur Wilson's estate, Henderson began, his voice measured and careful, I'm required to read the terms of the will in the presence of all beneficiaries. Gary's cousin David sat across the room, legs crossed, phone in hand, barely paying attention. At 52, David had the restless energy of a man always calculating his next move, always looking for the angle that would bring profit. He wore expensive boots and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Henderson read the bulk of the estate first. The main farmhouse, 300 acres of prime Montana ranch land, livestock, equipment, water rights to most of the property. All of it, every substantial piece of Arthur Wilson's life's work went to David. David's smile widened. He didn't even try to hide it. Then Henderson paused, adjusted his glasses again, and looked at Gary with something that might have been sympathy. To my grandson Gary Wilson, he read, who served his country with honor and returned home seeking the peace I always found in this valley, I leave the old leather training dummy that belonged to his grandmother Eleanor's first dog, and this note. Henderson slid a yellowed envelope across the desk. I also leave him the line cabin at the northern edge of the property and 10 acres surrounding it. The silence in the room was profound. David laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine bark of amusement. A dog toy? Grandpa left him a dog toy? He shook his head, already standing, already thinking about subdivisions and development deals. Well, Gary, I guess we know who the favorite really was. His voice dripped with mock sympathy. Maybe you can teach your mutt some new tricks. Gary said nothing. He reached down and accepted the worn leather dummy from Henderson's hands. It was old, stitched and restitched, shaped by decades of use. His fingers traced the seams, feeling the weight of it, not just physical weight, but the weight of intention. Rocky's head lifted immediately. The dog's entire demeanor changed. His ears stood at attention, his amber eyes fixed on the dummy with an intensity that Gary had learned to trust. Rocky shifted forward, a low, insistent whine building in his throat, not distress, but recognition. David was already at the door, phone to his ear, making calls about property assessments and market values. Gary folded the note into his jacket pocket and stood slowly, his knees protesting. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "Gary," the lawyer said quietly, "your grandfather was a thoughtful man. He didn't do anything without purpose." Gary nodded. He'd learned that lesson long ago, in another life, in another country, when understanding the purpose behind orders sometimes meant the difference between life and death. The line cabin stood where it had always stood, tucked into a grove of lodgepole pines with a view of the creek that ran silver and cold through the valley. It was small, just 2 rooms and a stone fireplace, but it was solid, built by hands that understood the Montana winters and the value of craftsmanship. Gary set the dummy on the rough-hewn table and unfolded the note. His grandfather's handwriting was shaky but clear. "Gary, if you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead. Rocky will know what to do. Take him to our thinking spot by the creek. Trust him. Trust yourself. You earned this, son, more than anyone knows. Grandpa Arthur." Gary read it twice, then looked down at Rocky. The dog sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the dummy, every muscle coiled with purpose. "What is it, boy?" Gary asked softly. "What did he leave us?" Rocky's tail thumped once against the floor. Gary had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now his instincts told him that Arthur Wilson, shrewd, patient, and fiercely protective of this land, had left him something far more valuable than acreage and livestock. He just had to figure out what. The thinking spot was a massive slab of granite that jutted out over the creek, worn smooth by a century of weather and worn boots. Arthur had brought Gary here as a boy, teaching him to fish, to listen, to understand that silence held more wisdom than noise ever could. Now, at 68, Gary stood on that same rock, the dummy in his hand, Rocky vibrating with barely contained energy at his side. "All right, boy," Gary said. "Show me." He threw the dummy, not far, his shoulder wasn't what it used to be, but Rocky launched after it with the speed and precision of a much younger dog. But instead of bringing it back for another throw, Rocky dropped to the ground, gripping the dummy between his paws, working at it with his teeth. "Easy," Gary called, moving closer. "Don't tear it up." But Rocky wasn't tearing. He was working methodically at a seam, tugging, pulling, persistent. And then, there, a small stitched compartment Gary had never noticed before began to open. Gary knelt beside his dog, ignoring the protest in his knees, and carefully pried the compartment wider. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a brass key. Engraved on its surface, 247. Gary sat back on his heels, the key heavy in his palm, his heart beating with the slow, steady rhythm of understanding. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Rocky pressed against his side, warm and solid and utterly faithful. "Good boy," Gary whispered, his voice thick. "Good boy." Montana Merchants Bank had stood on Main Street since 1903, a fortress of stone and certainty in a world of constant change. Gary pushed through the heavy doors, Rocky at his heel, and approached the desk with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced far more intimidating obstacles than bank protocol. The manager, a woman named Patricia, who remembered Arthur Wilson with genuine fondness, led them to the vault. Box 247 sat in a wall of identical boxes, anonymous and patient. The key turned smoothly. Inside was a single folder and a sealed envelope addressed in Arthur's hand. For Gary. Gary opened the envelope with careful fingers. "My dear grandson, if you're reading this, then Rocky did his job, and so did you. You didn't give up, you didn't assume the worst, you trusted and you persevered. Those are the qualities Eleanor and I valued most, and they're the qualities this land needs now. Inside this folder, you'll find the deed to Spring Creek Meadow, 40 acres of the most vital land in this valley. It's where the springs originate, where the water that feeds this entire region begins its journey. Your cousin David doesn't know about this parcel. It was set aside generations ago, held in trust, waiting for someone with the wisdom to protect it. I'm giving it to you because you understand what David never could, that some things are worth more than money. You fought for your country. Now I'm asking you to fight for this land. Protect the springs, protect the valley. Don't let them turn our home into profit margins and quarterly reports. You have the deed, you have the law on your side, and you have something even more valuable. You have integrity. Make me proud, son. All my love, Grandpa Arthur. Gary's hands trembled as he read. Rocky leaned against his leg, a warm, steadying presence. He opened the folder. The deed was there, legal and binding, along with water rights documentation, environmental surveys, and a letter from a conservation attorney outlining exactly how this land could be protected in perpetuity. Arthur had thought of everything. The call came 2 weeks later. David's voice on the phone was bright with greed, poorly disguised as enthusiasm. "Gary, great news. I've got a buyer for the property. Aquapure Corporation. They're willing to pay top dollar. They want to develop the springs, bottle the water, turn this whole valley into a revenue stream. We're talking millions, cousin, millions." Gary stood in the cabin doorway, watching the evening light paint the meadow gold. "The springs aren't for sale, David." "What are you talking about? I own this property. I can—" "You own 300 acres. You don't own Spring Creek Meadow. I do. Grandpa deeded it separately to me. The springs are on my land, David, and they're staying that way." The silence on the other end was a living thing. "You're lying," David finally said. "I have the deed, filed with the county, legal and binding. You want to see it? Come by the cabin, but the answer will still be no." David hung up without another word. Rocky, lying by the fireplace, raised his head and looked at Gary with something that might have been approval. "Storm's coming, boy, but we've been through worse."
Aquapure didn't give up easily. Their representative, a smooth-talking man named Thompson in a suit that cost more than Gary's truck, showed up 3 days later with lawyers and contracts and thinly veiled threats about eminent domain and economic development. Gary met them at the property line, Rocky at his side, both of them unmoved. "Mr. Wilson," Thompson began, flashing teeth that had never known hardship, "we're prepared to make you a very generous offer." "Not interested." "You haven't heard the number." "Don't need to." Gary's amber eyes, still sharp despite his years, held Thompson's without flinching. "This land isn't for sale. The springs aren't for sale. You can offer me all the money in the world, and my answer will still be no." Thompson's smile thinned. "You're standing in the way of progress, Mr. Wilson. Jobs, economic growth, the community." "The community," Gary interrupted, his voice quiet but edged with iron, "has been drinking from these springs for 150 years. These springs feed the creek feeds the farms feed the families. You want to bottle it up and sell it back to them at $5 a pop. Don't talk to me about community." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "We have options, Mr. Wilson. Legal remedies. You can try," Gary said, "but I spent 25 years in the service, and I learned a thing or two about standing my ground. I've got the deed, I've got water rights, I've got environmental protections, and I've got time. How much money you willing to spend on lawyers before your investors start asking questions?" Thompson's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "No," Gary said, and for the first time he smiled, a small knowing smile that came from a life lived with purpose. "Now get off my land." They left, but Gary knew they'd be back. Men like Thompson didn't accept defeat easily. Rocky growled softly as the black SUV disappeared down the valley road. "I know, boy," Gary murmured, resting a hand on the dog's head. "I know." The town whispered. At the diner, at the post office, at Sunday services, people talked. Some thought Gary was foolish to turn down millions. Others remembered Arthur Wilson's integrity and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the old veteran knew something they didn't. Gary walked Main Street with his head high, greeting neighbors who'd known him since childhood, enduring the stares of those who thought him stubborn or stupid or both. Rocky stayed close, a constant reminder that loyalty didn't require words. It was Clara Jenkins who changed everything. She was 82, sharp as a tack, and had been Eleanor Wilson's closest friend for 60 years. She found Gary at the hardware store, her eyes bright with purpose. "Your grandfather came to see me," she said without preamble, "about 6 months before he passed. Told me if anything happened, I should give you this." She handed him a worn leather journal. "It's Eleanor's. She kept records, every drought, every dry spell, every time those springs saved this valley. You want to fight Aquapure? This is your ammunition." Gary opened the journal carefully. Page after page of meticulous notes, dates, water levels, families helped, a historical record that proved beyond doubt that Spring Creek Meadow wasn't just land, it was life. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She patted his arm. "Your grandparents were good people, Gary. They chose right."
The county meeting was packed. Aquapure had made their case. Jobs, revenue, modernization. David sat in the front row, already counting his money. Thompson stood at the podium, polished and persuasive. Then Gary stood. He wasn't a public speaker. He didn't have PowerPoint presentations or economic projections. He had a 68-year-old veteran's steady voice, a dog-eared journal, and the truth. "My grandmother Eleanor," he began, "kept this journal for 43 years. In it, she documented every time Spring Creek Meadow saved this valley. The drought of 1988, the dry summer of 2001. Last year, when the creek ran low and everyone else's wells struggled, those springs kept flowing." He read excerpts, names of families, children born healthy because their mothers had clean water, crops saved, livestock sustained. "Aquapure wants to turn our water into profit," Gary continued, "but water isn't a commodity, it's a lifeline. My grandfather understood that, my grandmother understood that, and I'll be damned if I let anyone forget it." The room was silent. Gary set the journal down and looked at the faces of his neighbors, people he'd known his whole life, people whose parents and grandparents had drunk from those same springs. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to remember. Remember who we are. Remember what this valley stands for. And remember that some things are worth more than money." He sat down. Rocky, who had waited patiently outside, was brought in by a sympathetic clerk. The dog walked straight to Gary and sat at his feet, chin high, eyes forward. The vote wasn't even close. Aquapure's proposal was rejected. The county board voted to designate Spring Creek Meadow as protected watershed. David left without a word, his dreams of millions evaporating like morning mist. Thompson approached Gary in the parking lot, his expression unreadable. "You won," he said simply. "No," Gary replied, his hand resting on Rocky's head. "The valley won. I just stood my ground." Thompson nodded once, then walked away. 3 months later, Gary stood at the thinking spot, the same granite slab where Rocky had uncovered the key that changed everything. The autumn wind carried the scent of coming snow, and the creek ran clear and cold, its song unchanged by corporate ambition or family greed. Rocky sat beside him, graying muzzle resting on Gary's knee, the two of them watching the sun set over Spring Creek Meadow. Gary thought about his grandfather's letter, about Eleanor's journal,
about the moment in the law office when a dog toy seemed like a cruel joke. He thought about the path that had led him here, through war and loss, through healing and purpose, through the simple act of trusting a loyal dog and believing in something bigger than himself. At 68, Gary Wilson had learned that legacy wasn't measured in acres or dollars. It was measured in choices, in standing firm when it would be easier to give in, in protecting what mattered even when the world said you were foolish. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" he whispered. Rocky's tail thumped against the stone. In the distance, lights began to flicker on in farmhouses across the valley. Families gathering for dinner, children doing homework, neighbors living the quiet, ordinary lives made possible by clean water and protected land. Gary smiled. His body was older, his battles different than the ones he'd fought in uniform, but the mission was the same: protect what matters. Serve something bigger than yourself. Stand your ground. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Gary Wilson, veteran, grandson, guardian, felt the peace his grandfather had promised him, earned not through inheritance, but through loyalty, courage, and love. Rocky pressed closer, warm and faithful, and together they watched over the valley they had saved. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that loyalty, courage, and integrity still matter in this world, please take a moment to subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all forms, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, but always with hearts brave enough to stand for what's right. Thank you for watching. Until next time, may you find your own quiet courage, and may you always have a loyal companion by your side.